Hello everyone, I'm DonTheCrown, and today I want to talk about my Whirlwind Barbarian build that I've been min-maxing for over the last week since hitting level 100. And this build has been a real joy to play. It does really great just clearing normal packs of enemies, clearing overworld content, clearing nightmare dungeons, but did up to a level 70 without any real problems. And we've even been doing Uber Lilith attempts, and I think the single target damage will maybe surprise you a little bit. Now, if you're looking for some sort of cheat sheet to follow along with the build guide, everything's going to be up on the Mobalytics website, just like it was for my leveling guides. And so this should probably be available now. The link will be in the description down below, and you should even be able to pull it up on the overlay here if you have downloaded the overlay for Mobalytics. It just works right in the game, and you can follow along with what's going on in the build just like that. Now, this build is a little bit funky for Whirlwind because we are actually using a two-handed bludgeoning weapon to spin to win as opposed to using our two-handed slashing weapon. This kind of happened accidentally because we found a really good two-handed bludgeoning weapon that was just auto-selected by our Whirlwind, and I noticed that suddenly I was doing a lot more damage, and it was weird because we switched to our two-handed bludgeoning, which I didn't think was going to give us more damage. However, for some weird reason, Whirlwind scales with the weapon's attack speed, so a slower weapon actually hits much harder, and so things like one-handed weapons and swords are kind of at a detriment here compared to the very slow two-handed bludgeoning weapon, which is at a speed of 0.9 attacks per second versus 1 attack per second here for our two-handed slashing weapon. And so there's also a lot of really interesting things with the two-handed bludgeoning. We can kind of get away from going bleed, although you can definitely still select that on weapon expertise by going two-handed sword if you like, but two-handed axes is what I personally recommend. Now let's kind of hop into the skill tree here real quick, and I'm just going to try to go through everything. I'm going to probably try to have some gameplay here on the side for you. We'll see how the editing goes for that. But starting off, of course, we're going to be using Lunging Strike. Lunging Strike is really great, helps generate a little bit extra fury if you need to, helps you move around. It just overall is a really solid skill, and it allows us to use Aspect of the Expectant, which gives us additional damage if we swing basic skills basically and hit, which is very good. You can also get Berserking when you crit with Lunging Strike, and since we have quite a bit of crit chance right now, and we have crit chance when we swap weapons, and we're assigning our dual-wielded weapons to Lunging Strike. This allows us to crit quite frequently with Lunging Strike, keeping Berserking up, which just gives us a little bit more damage. Next up, Whirlwind. Of course, can't have a Whirlwind build without having Whirlwind, and this is just most of our damage is coming from this. Enhanced Whirlwind makes it so that we get more fury whenever we hit enemies and get more from hitting elites. And then we have to use Violent Whirlwind because the Furious Whirlwind requires that you use a slashing weapon, which we're not using. So we do our maximum damage after spinning for 2 seconds, which is an important thing to remember. So you always kind of want to make sure that you've really juiced up and filled up your fury gauge as much as possible, and really been ready to spin for an extended period of time when you're ready to spin, unless you're really just knocking down easy content. We next have Pressure Point here, 3 points. This is not really super duper great. 30% lucky hit chance times Whirlwind's base 20% means that this is only a 6% chance to hit. However, vulnerability basically gives us 5 times more damage. I did a whole video about that because vulnerable is just a ridiculous damage bucket right now that they maybe should nerf down a little bit. And so pressure points, even though it's lucky hit percent is very low, these 3 points are well spent here. Next up, we're going to be picking up the 2 shouts, Rallying Cry and Challenging Shout. And Rallying Cry is really great because it's going to give us fury or just resource generation, move speed, and unstoppable. Rallying Cry is really important when you are playing in any sort of situation where you get crowd controlled, because this is basically your get out of jail free thing. As long as you have this up, which lasts 7.4 seconds, you cannot be crowd controlled. Anything, you can't get pushed, anything is going to be completely ignored. Which means, likewise, if you're in a situation where you don't have Rallying Cry up, you kind of need to play more careful. So it's like, especially hard nightmare dungeons, you're in a situation where you might get froze or stunned, you don't have rallying cry. It's okay to kind of back off a little bit and allow for this to come off cooldown. That's a good thing to note. And the unstoppable comes here from the second node. And then I like using tactical rallying cry to give us even more fury generation, real big blast. However, in nightmare dungeons, it's a little bit easier to generate fury. So I'll typically go strategic rallying cry, because this gives us fortify. And also, while we have rallying cry active, getting hit just like zoops up our fortify super duper fast, because we're using a barrier thanks to the unique temerity. And so since we are getting hit on barrier as opposed to on our life, we aren't actually losing fortify value from getting hit, which means that the fortify value can cap out very, very quickly thanks to strategic rallying cry. Challenging shout, is just obvious. Like, you kind of have to include it in every barbarian build. Gives us massive damage reduction for a good amount of time, increases our maximum life, and it also makes it so that when we get hit while it's active, we get more fury, which can just let you spin to win even more. Now, in this next section is kind of where you're going to start to notice some maybe weird stuff that I'm doing a little bit different than some other builds. So, of course, we're including Warcry. Warcry is super important for doing more damage. This is a more damage multiplier, and since we're taking all the other shouts, it just makes sense to include it as well. It also grants us berserking, and I pick Mighty Warcry most of the time for just more fortify. However, if you're trying to just knock down weak targets, Power Warcry does a great job of doing that and increases your damage bonus by 10% if there are 6 enemies nearby. This is basically worthless for bosses, so I don't include it there. Then you have the 3 nodes, Booming Voice, Raid Leader, and Guttural Yell. These are all super duper important for just improving the overall power of your shouts, and they're kind of no-brainers to take. The weird thing here is Kick. So Kick, I think, is very underrated for a barbarian build, because Kick actually provides the longest form of vulnerable that we have in our entire kit. And vulnerable, like I said before, increases our damage by a lot, like 5 times more. So being able to apply vulnerable on command is a pretty big deal. And this comes with a 2 charge baseline, and with like decent cooldown reduction on our gear, it's down to 13-second cooldown, which allows us to keep vulnerable up quite a bit. And more vulnerable uptime is basically more real damage uptime. So really anything that we can do to apply vulnerable is a big deal. Now going down here, we have aggressive resistance, which gives us a little bit of damage reduction while we're berserking. And then battle fervor makes it so that when we hit with Kick, we also get berserking for 3 seconds. This is just more damage when I'm going and facing bosses in particular, and like Uber Lilith mostly. We are also going to be using the relentless berserkers aspect, which has a chance for core skills to basically extend the duration of your berserking. And since we're always critting, this can extend the duration by 2 seconds as opposed to 1. And so getting berserking is just more damage, which is a good thing to have. Likewise, Prolific Fury helps you generate more fury during that uptime. During bosses, I also like to have the Berserk Fury aspect as well, which gives us more fury while we're berserking. This is a little bit more impactful to me than the Bold Chieftains aspect for bosses, since cutting off like 1.9 seconds a shout is not really all that impactful when you're only getting 1 enemy nearby. Yeah, so this I think is, for me, the secret sauce for making single target kind of work. And so putting this into the build definitely is very noticeable for my single target damage. Next up, down here, we are only really taking Pit Fighter and Thick Skin and Counteroffensive. These are the things that give us more damage. We're not really applying Bleed, so No Mercy doesn't really work for us because we're not applying things to slow, things aren't mobilized or stunned, and so Hamstring doesn't really do anything for us. These also don't apply to like the toughest monsters in the game, like bosses and stuff. However, this could be kind of okay if you're fighting like hard, high-tier nightmare dungeons. I could see this coming back into play. Next up, we have 2 really big multipliers. Heavy-Handed, which gives us up to normally 15% increased critical strike chance when you only have 3 points into it. I also have this on my amulet, so I'm getting another 15%. And this acts like a multiplier for your critical strike damage, which is pretty nice. So the more critical strike damage you have, the more heavy-handed kind of helps. And then Wallop makes it so that we do more damage with bludgeoning weapons if the enemy is stunned or vulnerable. So that or word is pretty important there. So all we have to do is apply vulnerable, and we're just doing even more damage with our vulnerable. Lastly, key passives. Unbridled Rage is really the have to take it option here. Increases our damage dramatically. However, it does increase the fury cost by a lot. So if I'm doing really easy content, Unbridled Rage actually makes the build feel terrible. And so if I'm doing like Helltide or really anything that's like not a super high level thing, I will very frequently just switch Unbridled Rage over to Unconstrained, and this just solves all my fury problems. And we're basically still 2 to 3 tapping almost everything. The first hit comes in and applies vulnerable thanks to a glyph, which we'll talk about here shortly. And then the second hit comes by and kills it. Maybe the third hit if it's kind of tanky. And that doesn't really change whether or not we're using Unconstrained or Unbridled Rage. And so there's not really much reason for, when you're doing easy stuff, to be increasing your fury cost by 100%. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the skill tree. You can definitely move some things around. Like I know a lot of people really like Wrath of the Berserker. This is really nice because it provides a long period of unstoppable. I personally don't like this all that much, simply because it's just like a very long cooldown, and it kind of feels like you have to line a lot of things up with it. And I just don't feel like there's enough space up on the bar. If there was one more slot for an ultimate or something, I would of course pick Wrath of the Berserker, but I don't. If you're really worried about getting crowd controlled in Nightmare Dungeons, you could potentially switch Kick over to Charge, which can still apply a shorter vulnerable, but this has Unstoppable in it as well. And so I was using this back in the day when we were farming the Moggen's Works with tons of monsters just for an additional Unstoppable source. Next, let's talk about Paragon, and I'm going to go full screen here. And as you can see real quickly, we've decided to go for 5 Paragon boards. I used my item comparison tool, which is a totally different video, to kind of put in what I would get from putting in one more board and what I would have to cut out of all of the boards. And I didn't really think that it was worth going to one more board, at least not now. They did kind of cut down the power of a lot of the glyphs, and we're kind of limited to level 21 now. I'm sure that there's a chance that these are all going to be able to be leveled up even higher than this in the future. So maybe going for more boards at that time will be worth it. But for now, this is the boards we're using. Now, I have them set up in a particular order on the boards. However, your priority for them might be a little bit different. What I would recommend doing if you're first getting started off is that you really, really need 2 glyphs to be activated as fast as possible. And they are the Exploit glyph. This basically makes it so that when an enemy is damaged by you, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds. This is just massive. You don't have to level this up. You don't have to do anything fancy. You just need to put this with like 25 dexterity and range. So you could go put this down on the starter board and that would work. The second thing that you need is Wrath. Wrath helps because once it's activated with 25 dexterity, you basically, every crit is going to give you 3 fury, and you should be critting a whole ton with Whirlwind. And this is just very, very impactful for your build. So getting these online helps a ton. And also going and getting Warbringer gives us quite a bit of Fortify as we spin. Basically, every other spin, or every like, even more than that, is giving us a ton of Fortify, since we're spending like almost 50 fury per spin per second. And so this Fortify value just really stacks up quite quickly. Now, the other boards that are kind of important here, like this, the 2 dexterity boards, by the way, are Warbringer and Bonebreaker. These can both have 49 dexterity and range. So endgame, these are probably the boards that you want to put those 2 glyphs in. The other boards that have nodes on them that give us quite a bit of damage are Decimator and Weapons Master. And so that these rare nodes here are providing quite a bit of damage. Like we get damage to elites, we get physical damage here, which is okay. This is kind of like one of the worst nodes I think that we've taken, even though we've kind of cut out a whole ton of stuff. But the Decimator board here is really stupid because it has tons of vulnerable damage and damage reduction from vulnerable. So we get like 15% here, another 20. So that's like 35% vulnerable right there. These are all amplified by the Martial glyph, which is probably the third most important glyph. This not only makes it so that your shouts kind of lower the cooldown of the other shouts, kind of just like piling on one another. This also amplifies the effects of the magic nodes in range. So we're amplifying up the vulnerable damage that were provided here from this glyph. And we're also getting even more vulnerable damage. All of this stuff is pretty good. And I liked having this as one of my first boards because I wanted to easily activate all of the rare nodes on this particular tree. Now, over here is something that's kind of a little bit weird in that this destroyer node gives us damage with our two-handed slashing weapon, which doesn't really seem all that great. However, we also get vulnerable damage from all this area. So we just take the vulnerable damage and kind of dip out. This might seem like we're kind of going a far way out of our way in order to get these points. However, we do need to travel off of this board, either up, right, or left in order to get to the next board. And so this is effectively like a very short kind of sidetrack for vulnerable damage, which is a lot of damage for us. Likewise, over here, we have the Might glyph. The Might glyph is very powerful because it gives us just a 8% more damage increase. And this can just go right into this board here, the Weapons Master board. And this is going to also amp up the armor and some of the like willpower that's in this range. So getting a little bit more defenses from this. Willpower tends to be one of the things that I've been a little short on for activating other things. So clicking on these points here that are in range of these two glyphs basically is like getting 15 willpower as opposed to getting 7, which is really nice for hitting some of those breakpoints. Also, we're getting to get some physical damage and armor and strength, which is all really, really good. This point down here, Hunter Killer, is giving us some movement speed after we kill an elite. This is very noticeable in Nightmare dungeons. We'll kind of just zip and zoom after killing elites, which is really nice. And I know that there's a whole bunch of different ways to kind of go through and path this section, like going down here, going over here. But I found that for myself personally, this is the most efficient way to get the most like stats that I want. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the Paragon board. The order of boards I would put on would be Decimator first, and then I would go over here to Weapons Master, then up here to Warbringer, and this leaves the Bonebreaker board for last. So I'm not actually even activating this last inner strength node. We're not really taking very many of the yellow nodes here, so probably not going to be activating most of them until your gear is really, really good. This board is basically just here because it gives us the best dexterity options, and so we want to take all of the dexterity that is in range. This like overpowered damage stuff is tremendously bad for us because Whirlwind can't overpower, so pretty bad indeed. Next, let's go through the gear, and I'll talk about the gear that I have right now and some alternative options as well. So starting off, my hat is terrible. I wish that this was a little bit better. This is just the hat that I've had a while, and it has Whirlwind aspect. The Grasping Whirlwind pulls in, but really the main stat for me here was cooldown reduction. I do have a better hat that I use when I'm killing Uber Lilith, and this has cooldown reduction. It has armor, it has life, and shadow resistance isn't really all that great, but these are like some of the stats that I recommend. Once again, if you look at the Mobalytics website, I'll have a list of all of the stats kind of in their priorities, but like cooldown reduction, armor, and life are all really, really important here. Next up for body armor, I'm not using the Rage of Varagath. I'm using a rare body armor that has Ranks of Challenging Shout for more defenses. It has life and a whole bunch of defensive options. Now you could go out and use up armor like this. It also has Challenging Shout, damage, some damage reduction, even Ranks of Rallying Cry. And this might be okay as well. Ignore the aspect on this, but you just have to kind of figure out what's more important to you, to be more tanky or to have a little bit more damage. The Rage of Haragath chest is also pretty good. However, if you want to use this you have to use the two-handed sword expertise as your technique so that you're applying bleeding, because otherwise this won't work at all. Next up, the pants Temerity are real big deal for our build. And this is basically why we are able to use the Sapphire gems and get a lot of damage reduction while we're fortified. And so what this does, the special effect, it makes it so that effects that heal us beyond full health grant you a barrier for up to, and this goes all the way up to 80% of your maximum life, which lasts for 8 seconds. Each of our shouts basically heals us for 3% of our life per second, and they last for quite a long period of time. There's also a lucky hit chance here to heal us for 1000 HP. And so all of this kind of combines together to give us a pretty consistent barrier that is up. And the barrier is pretty important because when you get hit, let's say you're at full health, full fortify value, and then you get hit hard enough that you lose half of your health. Well, as you get hit for half of your health, you also lose half of your fortify. So even if you instantly potion and heal back up some way, your fortify value might be lagging behind, which prevents you from being eligible to be damage reduction while fortified. Because in order to be fortified, you have to basically have fortify value that's equal to or greater than your life. And so it makes the blue gems kind of a little scary to use if you're not using Temerity, which allows you to basically take damage while not losing fortify value all that much. And so Temerity, I think, is just pretty much best in slot here. You could potentially drop this altogether and then go and drop in some rubies instead. However, Temerity also enables us to be able to use the conceited aspect, which is quite a big damage aspect. This gives us increased damage while we have a barrier. And so these kind of things all work together to give us more defenses, more damage. It's just a really nice combination of things. Going back here, talking about gloves real quick. You might notice that I'm not using the unique gloves that kind of give you a little explosion, gores. I don't really personally like the explosion all that much. And this gives us the option to go and pick up another aspect here that gives us more damage, the aspect of the expectant. And you can put this basically on gloves, on either your two one-handed weapons. It doesn't really matter. This also gives us a chance to give us critical strike chance, strength, all stats, and more ranks of Whirlwind. It's kind of strange to me that Gores actually has attack speed, because for my testing, attack speed doesn't really seem to have much or any impact on whether or not like you're spinning any faster. And so having it on the unique for Whirlwind seems like kind of a spit in the face type of thing. So just having rare gloves is kind of better. Once again, going back for aspects I kind of forgot to mention, we're using disobedience aspect. This is one of the more important aspects for defenses. Gives us a lot of armor reduction. Right now I'm sitting at about 7,330, which gives us 60% reduced physical damage taken. And that's like also applying to non-physical damage, I believe at half of that value. So increasing your armor by quite a bit is very noticeable for your survivability. Next up for boots, priority here is movement speed, fury cost reduction, dodge chance, and then movement speed after killing an elite. I personally really like the max evade boot charges. I think that this is just really zoomy, and you can go and get yourself the Ghost Walker aspect, which just gives you even more movement speed whenever you're unstoppable, which is when rallying cry is up or for 4 seconds after it's up. So it has quite a large uptime. You could also potentially switch in something else here to, like, if you like having the critical strike thing, to have it a little bit more consistent, or maybe like things like anemia if you wanted to stun if you're also doing bleed. For our weapons, you're going to notice basically all of our weapons follow a trend. We have vulnerable damage, crit strike damage, strength, and then something else that provides damage. And this is the priority order. Like vulnerable damage is hands down number 1. Crit strike damage is hands down number 2. Strength is number 3. And then things like damage to close, damage to core, or all stats. These are the 3 things that should be on your weapons. So a perfect weapon basically looks like this. And so that is what all of our weapons have. Nothing super crazy here. We're using the green gems in them. Gives us critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. So once again, applying vulnerable becomes very, very important. You notice on my two-handed weapon, I have all stats. This is kind of helping me hit a lot of the breakpoints on my later boards so that I can activate them. So like when I'm trying to compare all stats versus like damage with core, I'm pretty much comparing like, hey, are all of the things that I'm activating on my later boards worth having all stats? Because all stats is not necessarily like the same as strength. However, willpower does give us more resource generation a little tiny bit, and dexterity does give us a little bit of crit, a little tiny bit, and a little bit of dodge chance. But for the most part, vulnerable damage, crit strike damage, strength are going to be our big boys. Now on two-handed weapons, you want to have the Whirlwind critical strike chance. Put on here maximum roll. I get a ton of these for some reason. And yeah, you definitely just want to put that on there. The other two-handed weapon, you want to use Limitless Rage. This basically just gives us even more damage multiplier, which is really ridiculous. On one-handed weapon, you're going to have Edge Masters. I actually can't find Edge Masters at all, so I'm having to put it off of the Codex, which is a real big shame, which is why my roll here is so low. But you put this on your one-handed weapon or glove, and then I'm putting Berserk Ripping, once again, on one-handed weapon or glove. On Amulet, we have the Conceited aspect, and Amulet has a lot of things that are really, really good to have on here. For me, though, having cooldown reduction is really important. Fury cost reduction is also really good as well. Strength isn't bad. Damage reduction stats, just raw damage on here is all really good. And then ranks of heavy-handed or wallop also give you quite a bit of damage. I think heavy-handed is probably the best passive that you can have right now, just because it multiplies your damage when you're using a two-hander, the crit damage that is. So you can see here, for example, we're at 491 crit strike damage. If I take this off, note this doesn't have any crit strike damage. We lose almost 70 crit strike damage. So that is a pretty nice stat to have indeed. Next up for rings, you're going to want the Bold Chieftain's aspect and the Echoing Fury aspect, just to give you like some shout, fury generation action. Bold Chieftains pretty much helps make it so that your shouts are going to be off cooldown quicker. And then having Echoing Fury makes them just generate more fury for you. So you can basically be standing still and shout, and your fury is just going to fill up super duper fast. Note that this does scale based on how many shouts you have active, and Rallying Cry does give you a ton of resource generation, which is pretty nice. For rings, I recommend resource generation as a pretty important stat here. Vulnerable damage, and then crit strike damage, crit strike chance are all pretty good. This ring here is basically like nearly perfect. Absolutely disgusting. Resource gen, vul, and crit. Very, very nice. And this is definitely what I would recommend. Now, for gameplay in general, it's a pretty simple build to play. We just want to make sure that we have Fury and we have capped out our aspects for doing more damage. And so if you, as you build up your Fury, you'll notice this little symbol here builds up to a 60. This is your Limitless Rage. You want to make sure that this is always active before you start spinning. This is going to give you quite a bit more damage. Also, going out and hitting with basic skills will increase your overall damage from the aspect of the expectant. So I can see here, as I'm left clicking, this one here is building up to 30. And so, you know, we just spin to win right through packs and everything goes perfectly fine. And you notice that this is the damage we're doing without having Unbridled Rage, and enemies for the most part are just dying the second time they get hit. They get hit once and then they die a second on the second hit. That's because of how vulnerable damage is working. We're just absolutely annihilating packs and just knocking them down. Yeah, that's pretty much it. The one thing I would note with kick is it's also pretty fun in PvP. You can like kick enemies and they'll go away from you. But if you're able to kick them into a wall, this is kind of a bad spot to try to kick enemies into a wall, they will get stunned. And enemies that don't have some sort of unstoppable when they get stunned, for the most part, are just going to die. You guys are all too weak for me to show an example. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Let me know if you guys have any questions in the comments below. It's been a really, really fun build for me to play, and I'm looking forward to min-maxing some other builds in the Barbarian space, and we'll see how it goes. Thank you much, guys, for tuning in. We'll see you again next time.